The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
The year 2030 and Canada's climate targets set for that date are closing in. Whoever forms the next government of Ontario will be essential to meeting those commitments. We'll find out what the major parties are saying about the climate file tonight. Then, as part of our ongoing partnership with the Council of the Great Lakes region this year, we'll turn our attention to water conservation and this election. It's Thursday, May 12th, and that's tonight on the agenda. Incidentally, from the fourth floor here at 2180 Yonge Street at TVO, as we prepare to host the Leaders' Debate on Monday in our studio. After the 2018 election, one of the first things Ontario's new premier did was cancel the cap-and-trade system that had just begun in Ontario. Fast forward to 2022, and the conversation is all about electric vehicles, the green economy, and highways? Anyway, let's find out how the major parties' plans stack up with all in Ontario's capital city, starting with Keith Brooks. He's the program director at Environmental Defence. Adi Dunkelman is advisory manager at Clear Blue Markets. Aaron Andrews is founder and executive director of Impact Zero. And Andy Takagi is reporter with Queen's Park Briefing. And we are delighted to welcome all of you to our program here this evening. Andy, to you first. You've been following the PC campaign, and I think it's fair to say that when you think of the PC party, you don't necessarily think of climate change first. So let's start with this. Has the party had anything relevant to say about climate change during the campaign?
Yes, so they're mostly betting on electric vehicles and highways, like you mentioned. They've released some things before their budget. Climate doesn't really show up as much in the actual document itself, but they've announced, $82 billion for transportation infrastructure. That includes transit and highways. Obviously, they're committing to build the Highway 413, Bradford Bypass. One of their, I guess, kind of hidden goals is to hit 30% reduction in emissions by 2030. That's a little less ambitious than what the other parties have promised. But, they've also secured some pretty high-profile electric vehicle battery production plant deals with Stellantis and LG. So, that's kind of where they're landing.
Okay, don't know if you caught the Leaders' Debate in Northern Ontario in North Bay a couple of days ago, but any takeaways from that debate that might add to what the Tories have to say on climate change?
Not in terms of climate change. It mostly focused on, obviously, the Northern Ontario municipalities. There were some commitments to build highways, bring back the Northlander, which would obviously help with transportation from Northern Ontario to the south. But besides that, climate wasn't a big issue for anyone, I'd say, besides the Greens.
Okay, let's move on here. I want to talk about the NDP platform right now. And Sheldon, if you would, we'll bring this graphic up to talk about what the NDP have on offer. It's called their Green New Deal, and it includes reaching net zero greenhouse gas emissions by the year 2050, planting 1 billion trees by the year 2030, introducing a new cap-and-trade system where 25% of revenue goes to support vulnerable communities most affected by carbon pricing. The Greens' zero-carbon law will limit all greenhouse gas emissions to 1,630 megatons by the year 2100 and increase carbon pricing by $25 per ton up to $300 per ton by the year 2032, revenues then to be returned as dividends. All right, let's get into this. Keith, Environmental Defence has dedicated a section of your website to encourage Ontarians, to, quote, vote for the environment. Would the NDP's Green New Deal be a vote for the environment, in your view?
Well, I got to be careful, Steve, because as a charity, we have to be nonpartisan. So I really cannot endorse any particular party's platform, but I will say there are differences between the platforms. We're encouraging people to go to our website to see what makes a good environmental plan. We also have a platform comparison up at a site called greenprosperity.ca. And you can see there's pretty stark differences between the different climate change plans. But I think the really big one was highlighted earlier, is that they have different targets, different levels of ambition. You have the current government committing to reduce emissions by 30% by 2030, and all the other parties have committed to reduce emissions by at least 50% by 2030. And to put that in context, that's a 40 megaton difference. I think most people will be aware of the coal closure. We phased out coal in Ontario. That reduced emissions by 30 megatons. So the difference now between most of the party's plans and the governing party is 40 megatons. So that's more than the phase out of all the coal plants in Ontario.
Well, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but when you say vote for the environment, the way you've just described it, if you want to vote for the environment, you're not voting Conservative in this election. You want to say that?
Well, we asked the Conservative Party what their platform was on the environment. We did a survey and we asked each party to respond to a series of questions, one of them about climate change, and asking parties, would they commit to reducing emissions by 60%? That's what the environmental community is seeking. And I'll say three of four parties responded. The governing party did not respond to the survey, so I can't actually include them in the comparison.
Gotcha. Adi, the federal government, of course, recently released their 2030 emissions reduction plan. And I guess some people are going to wonder whether, pollution doesn't respect provincial boundaries, obviously. So how important do you think provinces are to the actual outcome of trying to get to the reductions we're looking at by the year 2030?
It's critical. All the provinces have to play a role, especially Ontario, its size and being a significant emitter. There needs to be collaboration and some sort of alignment between governments across parties to ensure the implementation of these strategies, the deployment of the dollars, and also to encourage certainty for the industry, for individuals trying to make those investments and change. So there needs to be a lot of alignment across the different levels of government.
Do you see that in the NDP's Green New Deal?
Yeah, I think that there is some alignment in terms of, the electric vehicle mandates and looking at carbon pricing in a serious way. They are proposing a cap and trade system, which would take us back to what the Liberals had before the previous election. And it would make us have to think of what a complete overhaul of a new carbon pricing system would mean for emitters, for individuals, and if that is the case, how to implement that in a meaningful way, and lessons learned from what happened with cap and trade last time.
Gotcha. Aaron, let's just find out a little more about Impact Zero before we start here. You apparently mobilize and connect local sustainable businesses to achieve a circular economy. That's the buzzwords. Tell us what that means.
Yeah, exactly. So a lot of the things that we're even talking about today are about policies and funding that needs to happen in communities in order to build sustainable infrastructure. But what we do at Impact Zero is we empower people who really care about the environment to actually take action, and we teach them how to go from being a person who cares a lot to being someone who actually is doing something on the ground to actually divert waste from landfills or get their community in more sustainable, have more sustainable options so consumers can change their behaviors given the systems that we have. So we build those systems to help people participate in a more sustainable or zero waste economy.
And does the provincial government traditionally support your work?
So we have not successfully received funds from provincial governments. We have from municipal, and we're going after some federal funding. But a really big problem for myself as a nonprofit leader, but even for the clean tech small startup founders that we work with, is getting funding. Traditional banking routes and traditional grant requirements exclude actually a lot of these innovators from getting the funding they need. And we're talking like not a lot of money, like $5,000 to $10,000 maybe in the first year to get these innovations started, and getting funding is really difficult for sure.
Now, I appreciate the fact that you're a charitable nonprofit, and I don't want to get you into trouble with Canada Revenue Agency. Having said that, if you want to opine on the Green New Deal that the NDP has brought forward, we'd love to hear what you've got to say.
Well, I would just like to say about the NDP platform that there is a lot of great intersectional policies that they've put forward. However, I did do a control find, and there is no word of the circular economy. So anyone that's talking about waste or trying to divert or reduce our reliance on resources needs to be talking about the circular economy, and that is not in their platform.
Okay, let's talk highways, which you wouldn't necessarily think of as environmental policy. And Keith, I got a feeling that Well, I'm going to try to make sure that your head doesn't explode as we talk about highways here and the contribution they make to the environment. But there have been two significant proposals, obviously, from the current government of Ontario, Highway 413 and the Bradford bypass, that have caught a lot of attention. In your judgment, what would the creation of those highways mean for the environment?
Oh, these highways will have immense impacts on the environment. I mean, the 413 is 60 kilometers long, 170 meters wide. It would destroy 400 acres of the Greenbelt, 2,000 acres of prime agricultural land. This is some of the best farmland in all of Canada, actually. It's going to drive more sprawl, create more car-dependent communities. It cuts through the Greenbelt. It cuts across 100 rivers and streams. It's going to cause more salt pollution in those rivers and streams. We already have a lot of salt pollution lower down in the Credit River and in the Humber River from the 401 and the QEW, and this is going to cause a lot more salt pollution. We've got endangered species habitat up there. Highly, highly problematic, and it's really going to do nothing to relieve congestion. It's been studied, forwards and backwards, and an expert panel previously said it's going to save drivers 30 seconds a trip because we build new roads, we just get new cars on those new roads, and then also I almost forgot to mention we're talking climate change. The highway, it's going to put 17 additional megatons of carbon pollution into the air by 2050. So it's going in the wrong direction on multiple fronts.
Andy, presumably the Conservative government knows and knew all this when they were pitching these highways. So maybe you need to fill us in on what the politics are for them in championing these two highways.
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's really just an appeal to drivers, right? That we've seen that as a pattern throughout this kind of campaign and pre-campaign period. Obviously, you have the license plate sticker fee refunds that came out. The checks started rolling in right as the election started. And the PC's argument is essentially that by reducing congestion, by reducing commute times for drivers, that will drive down emissions. Whether or not that's actually true, we don't know. We also don't know a lot about the environmental impacts for Highway 413 and the Bradford bypass, as the environmental assessments have kind of been watered down, or we're still waiting on them. So it's all a little vague.
Now, Andy, when you're on the hustings and you point out to the Premier when he does take reporters' questions that there are independent studies that show that you could spend $10 billion and save people 30 seconds a trip, how does he respond to that?
Well, it's pretty rare to get a question in with the Premier, but even when you do, it's usually something about getting it done, that he's the only government that his government is the only government that is saying yes, that is building. And then it's usually something about the previous Liberal governments propped up by the NDP who haven't built anything or just criticized. And that's usually what his main talking points are.
Okay, let's continue the conversation about cars here, because one of the ironies in this campaign, and I guess over the last 4 years, is that when Doug Ford and the Conservatives came to office in 2018, one of the first things they did was get rid of the incentives to purchase electric vehicles. They also ripped out all the charging stations along the highways that the previous government was building. And then somewhere along the way, they got religion, because they are offering massive subsidies now for electric vehicle production and batteries for EVs. So let's just do a bit of a checklist on that. Here is what the four major parties have on offer as it relates to cars. The PCs, $5 billion in investments to build electric vehicle battery plant in Windsor, Ontario, a multi-billion-dollar investment in General Motors and Honda for their plants to build EVs. Still no rebates, though. If you want to buy a car, an electric vehicle, no rebates as an incentive to do that. The New Democrats are offering a $600 incentive for households to install charging stations at their homes. And they are offering an incentive to purchase an electric vehicle, $10,000, luxury vehicles excluded. The Liberal Party, $8,000 incentives for buying or leasing a new electric vehicle, a provincial subsidy program to cover 30% of the cost of public electric charging stations. And the Greens, of course, are all over this. They've got a Made in Ontario EV supply chain strategy, as they call it, $10,000 provincial rebates for fully electric vehicles. And if you're a cyclist, $1,000 for an e-bike. And then an Indigenous-led mining process is also part of the Green platform on this. Okay, let's get some feedback on this. Aaron, your thoughts?
To be completely honest, I care less about EVs and I care more about public transportation. EVs are definitely critical, I think, in more rural areas. It's really important to talk about how car transportation can change. But when we're saying that 44% of Ontario's emissions in 2020 were from the GTHA, we really need to talk about more local public transport that is where it works properly, it's accessible for a majority of people to actually use, because electric powered public transport could be incredibly impactful if we actually had access to it versus just getting new highways.
I take your point, but presumably if you could get all those internal combustion cars off the road and replace them with electric vehicles, that would go a long way towards reducing that 44% you just referenced, no?
Absolutely. But if you think of it from a resource perspective as well, the materials that go into producing these batteries, we don't have proper recycling infrastructure that can work at scale. It just seems a lot easier, honestly, to put in proper rail systems that everyone can use that work properly and connect to municipal transportation systems as well in a real way, than having to force everybody to pay a lot of money, honestly, and force them to purchase these really expensive vehicles.
Okay, Adi, we've got the Conservative government having offered hundreds of millions of dollars in subsidies to the big automakers to either build battery plants here or convert their lines to creating electric vehicles here in the province of Ontario. Lots of incentives from the other parties as well. How does it all look to you?
Well, it's only one part of the solution. There is a lot of emissions coming from the transportation sector, of course. It's one of the biggest contributors to emissions in the province and across Canada. So this is how the government is trying to incentivize that transition to zero emission vehicles, and coupled with a strong carbon price and the increasing cost of gasoline and other fuels, that can further support that transition. But we need those incentives to really get that step to those kind of modes of transportation.
You really believe that people need incentives in the years ahead in order to make the conversion from internal combustion to EV?
There's always going to be the early adopters. There's going to be the people that need, that want to do it for the environment or that's interest. But there will be some people that need that push, whether it's coming from incentives or it's coming from the carbon price and the avoided cost of gasoline.
I guess I should do one of these full disclosure things here. I drive a Chevy Volt. And have for 10 years, the same car, and like it a lot, and it's an EV. So I just put that on the record for people's edification. Mm-hmm. Okay, Keith, your view of all of the different things on offer from the four major parties as it relates to electric vehicles and batteries?
Well, we think electric cars are part of the solution. I think Aaron's right. We need better public transit as well, for sure. We need people on electrified rail and more subways and more LRTs and all that kind of stuff. But I think electric cars are going to be part of the mix. People do need incentives to get into those vehicles for now, and we can see when Ontario canceled the incentives, the electric vehicle sales took a massive hit, right? They just kind of went down, and we lost pace with other leading jurisdictions. In addition to incentives, though, we also need what's called a zero emissions vehicle mandate or standard that requires that automakers sell a rising share of electric cars. And this is one thing that the federal government has promised, and some of the provincial parties are promising as well, although the PCs have not promised this. And the problem is, so now we're committed to building electric cars here in Ontario. That's a good thing. But if we don't require that automakers sell those cars here, they're going to be very hard to get, and Ontarians won't be able to buy EVs that are being manufactured in this province.
Keith, let me follow up with you on that, because I think I read something the other day about the fact that the state of California has passed just such a regulation, which says that they're not going to be able to sell internal combustion cars in the state of California anymore, starting, I think, in about 15 years, something like that. Is that the kind of thing you want to see in the province of Ontario?
Yes, I mean, some states are banning sales of cars, of internal combustion engines. The federal government has said they would ban them by 2035, and some of the provincial parties have echoed that as well. And what you want to do, though, is get, like we want to have a rising share of EVs sold each year, getting up to 100%, just like we have carbon targets kind of getting us down to net zero. And that creates a predictable market. It means that there's a supply of EVs available. And I don't know what your experience was, Steve, but a lot of people that we know, they say, oh, it's time for me to switch to electric car. They go to the dealership, though. There's none on the lot. They can't test drive one. If they put their name on a list, they wait 6 to 8 months to get a car. Some of these cars are being made here, and they're only being sold in Quebec or in BC because those provinces have a zero emissions vehicle mandate, which requires that the cars get sold there. Ontario doesn't, and so that we just don't get prioritized.
Gotcha. Okay, Andy, come on in here and talk to us about the politics of all this. Obviously, the government, the Progressive Conservative Party, had the power of the purse to be able to tap into in order to offer these hundreds of millions of dollars in subsidies to the big automakers to do their thing here. The other parties have got the aspects of their platforms that they do to incent the purchase of EVs. How's it all rolling out to the way you look at things?
Yeah, so I mean, aside from the power of the purse, the province also has, or the Ford government also has the power of, official government announcements. They've been rolling out just kind of pre-election campaign announcements since February, essentially. And that's kind of helped their platform roll out, right? Especially before the budget came out, which they delayed until April, which was originally set for March. So, I think it's really tough. The Greens are ahead of the pack in terms of promises, right? They have probably the most ambitious plan, but they have the slimmest chance of forming government from one seat. The NDP and the Liberals obviously are in a tighter race. I'd say obviously the NDP are a little bit more gung-ho with their policies, but they're not too far removed from where the Liberals are at. So, in the next coming days, we'll probably see, or in the coming weeks along the campaign trail, we'll probably see one party steamroll ahead, and that will be the competitor to Doug Ford's BCs.
Okay. Keith, let me do one more follow-up with you on this, and that is last Sunday I watched Diane Sachs, the deputy leader of the Green Party, knock on doors in downtown Toronto in the riding that she is seeking to be elected in, University Rosedale. And one of the things that she told me was, I know everybody thinks EVs are the big salvation for pollution in our province, but she said if you just take all the cars with internal combustion engines off the road and replace them with electric vehicles, you've still got too many cars on the road, and you've still got issues of sprawl and needing to build more highways and so on. I guess a two-part question. Number one, is she right about that? Number two, if she is, what do we do about it?
She is right about that. I mean, we have an issue with congestion for sure, right? People are getting stuck in traffic, and that's why the government's promising to build these new highways. So I need to repeat that we know the highways are not going to relieve congestion. The way to relieve congestion is by building more transit, like Aaron was speaking to, right? We need to expand the GO network. We need to expand regional transit in areas. We need to get that intercity transit going. We're talking maybe now about high-speed rail here in Ontario too. I mean, we've been behind on building transit. We've got an infrastructure deficit. It's hundreds of billions of dollars because transit's been so politicized. It's expensive to build. It takes a long time to build. Every government that comes to power has their own transit plan, and then there's jurisdictional battles between municipalities and the provinces, and they're asking for, anyway, it's super complex. But we need to build transit as part of the answer, and we want to build also, it's how we build communities, right? People need to be in densities that support transit. There's enough people living close by that we can justify building a GO station there, or a subway station, or an LRT station. And people want to live in walkable neighborhoods where they have a choice to get around. And that's one of the problems with the mode of development being offered in Ontario, is that it is more highways, it's more sprawl, it's more car dependency. It's going to put more cars on the road, do nothing to alleviate congestion.
Okay. In our remaining 7 or 8 minutes here, let's talk about creating jobs and regulating industries. And Aaron, I'll get you in here first. We're seeing some awfully big numbers tossed around in this campaign, and I want to get your view on that, because the Green Party, for example, is pledging $1.7 billion over 4 years to cover 1 year of college and paid apprenticeships for 60,000 students entering the so-called green workforce. The New Democrats are talking about creating 1 million jobs and by transitioning to a green economy. I guess I need to know off the top here, do you think these kinds of promises with such big numbers are realistic?
Honestly, as much as I'd like to believe that all of that would happen, another piece of the puzzle is not really being addressed, which is investing in the clean innovation to create all of these green businesses that people can eventually work for. Another consideration is there's a lot of really great investment happening in youth jobs, which I completely support. But I'm even in the process. I also am a consultant at SCB Consulting, and we're trying to hire new immigrants as employees, and we're having a hard time getting funding for them, people who are transitioning into the green space or have experience. So I think the funding is good, and if they want to throw big numbers on it, that's fine. But they also need to think about how we're going to support the innovation to create the actual jobs that these people can then work for in the long term.
Okay, if you're talking about investing in clean innovation, that's going to take me to a D next, because your company, Clear Blue Markets, specializes in carbon pricing and offsets. And I think we need to understand just off the top, give us an idea of how a so-called output-based system works.
Yeah. Output-based pricing system is essentially a carbon price on industrial emitters. So it creates the price incentive or the price signal for them to reduce their emissions and also invest in clean technology alternatives. So essentially it puts a emission intensity benchmark that the facility would need to meet, or if they exceed it, they have to pay for each ton of CO2 in excess of that benchmark, and it provides the incentive to reduce their emission intensity. So how much do they emit per their unit of product underneath that benchmark, so that they can generate credits that they can then sell to other regulated emitters. So it's putting that price signal and incentive to make that transition.
So you're trying to create a market, essentially.
Yeah, it's a market-based system, and it's set to protect the competitiveness of these industries, understanding that we still need the cement and steel for our economy, but trying to encourage them to produce those products in an energy-efficient way.
Okay, so if it's a market-based system, it sounds like a very capitalist thing to do. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, yes.
So you'd think if you were a conservative, you'd be into this?
Absolutely. It is by nature a conservative approach to addressing, climate change and emission reduction. So it provides that flexibility and having the market to set the price and reduce emissions in a cost-effective manner. Carbon pricing is one of the most effective tools to achieve emission reductions in an efficient way, and it's used globally to incentivize that transition.
In which case, I'm really trying hard not to lead the witness here, but if it's a capitalistic idea, market-based, that conservatives ought to like, how much support have you seen in the current government of Ontario for this idea?
So Ontario, we do have a provincial industrial emitter program called the Emission Performance Standard, but that has been largely driven by the federal government's requirement for all the provinces to have their own carbon pricing system. So while we do have it, and it is meeting that federal requirement in terms of stringency and pricing, and it will be revised after the election if the Conservatives are victorious, then they'll have that system in place, and that will regulate industrial emissions in the province. But we have to think that can that program stand on its own if the federal government was not mandating that requirement? If there's a change at the federal level, will we still see this program in Ontario from the Conservative Party?
Okay. Andy, just in our remaining moments here, you've been covering this campaign. What have you not seen that you think is missing from any of the parties as it relates to campaigning on the environment?
Obviously the Green Party, it's in their name. They have been pushing on climate change. It's one of their key platforms. Diane Sachs, who's the deputy leader, is also the former environmental commissioner, whose position was axed under the Ford government. So, there's a lot of emphasis there on climate change policy. I think the NDP and the Liberals have been trying to focus on competing policies that push back against Doug Ford's rhetoric of getting it done, quote unquote, right? They want to appeal to the unions, to people who want jobs to come back to the province, who want ease of transportation. They're not pushing climate change, especially as a key point or a buzzword, right? They're looking for creating jobs, building infrastructure. Those are the kinds of things that the NDP and Liberals have been focusing on. And I think that's in part to combat the rhetoric of the PCs.
Well, in fact, we had the head of LIUNA, the Laborers International Union of North America, on the program, Joe Mancinelli, a couple of nights ago, and he confirmed he is endorsing the Progressive Conservatives in this, but of course, they build a lot of highways. Let's put that on the record. Okay, in our remaining couple of minutes here, let me get from the remaining three of you. I know you have wish lists that are probably in the range of hundreds, if not thousands of items long. I want one. What's at the top of the wish list? Aaron, start us off.
I would say funding to support individuals who want to create solutions on the ground. That's my thing.
If you had one thing, that would be what you would wish for.
Honestly, yeah, because it's very impactful from a dollars perspective, investing $5,000 in a startup. We had one of our accelerator participants who she got $700 in funding, and she's diverted 180,000 black plastic containers from landfill. And that's very high ROI, in my opinion, is in community investment for sure.
Huh, fabulous. Okay. Adi, how about you?
On our wish list, it would be a strong carbon pricing program and market and regulatory certainty. So understanding what we are facing as businesses, as individuals, and allowing that transition to occur and those investment dollars coming in so that we can make those changes. So a strong carbon price and market certainty. Which
party do you think you could get that from as people consider who to vote for on the 2nd?
I think it can come from, well, the Liberals and the Greens are proposing to keep the programs that we have now and tweak them to be more stringent and have that strong incentive in pricing. NDP, it would be a little bit of challenge to stomach another overhaul, but if it's what we can have as an orderly transition to a cap and trade system, that's what we had with the Liberal parties, it could be beneficial as long as then we have that certainty going forward. But if we want to have businesses make those investments to clean technologies, we need that certainty.
Keith Brooks, last word to you.
Well, we want to see a government that has a serious plan around climate change, a government that promises that Ontario is going to do its part to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. This is a global goal. Canada signed on to it, and we need all the provinces to do their part. Right now, Ontario is not part of that. In fact, the province is pulling in the wrong direction. And we need policies to address all the major sources of carbon pollution in the province, and that's industry, it's transportation around EVs, that's buildings, getting to a net zero building code, it's changing the way that we build our cities and stopping urban sprawl and canceling these highways.
I want to thank Keith Brooks from Environmental Defence, Adi Dunkelman from Clear Blue Markets, Andy Takagi from Queen's Park Briefing, and Aaron Andrews from Impact Zero for joining us here on TVO tonight. Many thanks for sharing your views.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dave.
Thank you.
There are people and places in the province who know very well just how much they rely on the Great Lakes. Some others don't always seem to realize the importance of those vast bodies of water. And come election time, well, let's pay some attention to them now, shall we? In Waterloo, Ontario, Kelsey Leonard. She is Canada Research Chair and Assistant Professor in the Faculty of Environment at the University of Waterloo and a member of the International Joint Commission's Great Lakes Water Quality Board. And here in Ontario's capital city, Michelle Woodhouse, Water Program Manager at Environmental Defence, and it's great to have you two on our program tonight. Michelle, to you first. We have been working on a few different campaigns within the Great Lakes region, especially on Lake Erie. Give us some updates on what's going on there now.
Yeah, so For Lake Erie, we have the Ontario government and Canadian government that are trying to work together to meet our 40% reduction targets for phosphorus inputs into the basin, into the central and western basin of the lake. And right now, as it stands, we have been waiting on an implementation plan for the last few years since something called the Canada-Ontario Lake Action Plan was released. And this is meant to help province and government, federal government work together to meet our commitments, binational commitments under the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement for addressing nutrient management issues and pollution in the Great Lakes. And currently, as it stands, we haven't received an implementation plan yet. We had some aspirational interim targets, such as in 2020, where we had the province that the leadership that was empowered during the time commit to aspirational goal of 20% reductions by 2020 from 2008 levels. However, we haven't had any updates or progress reports back on how we're doing at meeting those targets or how we're measuring the effectiveness of the current investment levels and policies we have in place to try and meet those targets.
Kelsey, let's get you in here now. How do the challenges faced by Lake Erie affect First Nations communities in the province of Ontario?
Well, I think it's really important for us to actually consider that Lake Erie is an international lake. So it's not just we can't just set imaginary boundaries of it only affects First Nations in Ontario, it only affects the province of Ontario. It is an international lake, so it affects both states in the U.S. and cities and communities surrounding the basin. It also affects First Nations that are on what's currently known as the Canadian side of the border, and then those also on the U.S. side of the border. And for those First Nations and Indigenous nations and communities that have been living and stewarding this portion of the world for thousands of years, it's very emotionally as well as physically harmful for communities to have to deal with the legacy of contamination that we see in the Western and Central Basin. Despite those legacy contaminants and the legacy of environmental harm in this particular portion of Lake Erie, we also see great innovation happening, utilizing Indigenous knowledge and science and stewardship practices to think about how we can push forward to meeting some of these targets that were just mentioned to really try and address nutrient overload in the lake.
I often hear, though, Kelsey, that although we talk a good game in Ontario in terms of what we're able to bring to this party to clean things up, it's in fact our American cousins on the other side of the border and some of the states there that are actually doing a better job at that. Can you weigh in on that?
Yes, and I don't necessarily want to say that someone's doing a better job than others. What I will say is that our U.S. counterparts have an influx of resources, and they really have put monetary capital behind research and innovation and restoration efforts through its initiatives like the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. And we're not seeing the same type of capital investments on the Ontario provincial side, as well as on the federal side for the Canadian federal government. And so when we're thinking about what does it take to tackle one of, there are gravest environmental harms across the Great Lakes Basin, what we're seeing in the central and western basin of Lake Erie, we need more resources. We need for citizens around the Great Lakes to realize the type of environmental harm and degradation that's been occurring in the basin for, over a century, but more commonly known in the past half century as an area that their tax dollars and their resources should be going towards help conserving and restoring.
Okay, Michelle, let's pick up another issue here, namely algae bloom. That's among the top issues that we hear about. Again, we've talked about on this program. Give us an overview of how it's affecting water systems in the province of Ontario again.
Yeah, for sure. So we are seeing the presence of algae blooms and the severity of them consistently increasing over the years. We have some years that are worse than others, but we are seeing a trend that the blooms are becoming worse. They are growing and they're toxic. And the issue with these blooms is that they end up suffocating out the oxygen from the lakes. They can cause fisheries to collapse. They cause very high costs to drinking water sources because the water treatment that you need to use to when there is high levels of contamination from the blooms is very expensive to implement. These cause issues to human health. They can be fatal to animals. And it also is impacting things such as tourism because it limits opportunities for recreational use and leisure use of the lakes. It even impacts things such as property values because of just how bad these blooms are when they grow to be quite large and toxic.
So it really behooves us to do something about this, in your view.
Yes, absolutely.
I am picking that up, indeed. All right, Kelsey, back to you. I note that the federal government recently announced a $144 million program in Indigenous leadership to foster community-led climate action. You know, when you think of climate action, I suspect a lot of people think big, right? They think about big international organizations that can work on this. But this is very much focused on very local, very community-focused action. How much of a role can that play in getting us to the finish line here?
It is critical and vital to getting us to the finish line. And I think what is really interesting about this funding inflection is also that these communities who are now, having the potential to access this funding, they are on the front lines of our climate crisis. They're already being directly impacted by climate change and by these climatic changes in their local communities. And so they've already been fighting and working towards achieving climate action in their local communities for decades, if not longer. And they've been doing so very resource strapped and without funding capacity. And so I think what we're seeing now is, even with that limited funding, the amount of success that local community activists have had in changing the types of opportunities we have to address our climate crisis, that now the funding and resources are going to be put back into those communities to expound upon and to build upon the great foundation that they've already laid. So I think it's a very promising initiative, but it also pales in comparison to some of the other types of funding opportunities and resources that are being put forward to address our climate crisis. So although it's a great step in the right direction, we still are going to need more resources to truly tackle our climate crisis.
And where are you going to get those resources from?
Exactly. And I think it really should be coming from the federal government. I think we also need to see more advocacy at the provincial government level. And, through the Great Lakes Water Quality Board and the International Joint Commission, we do a Great Lakes regional poll every 3 years. And consistently in our 2015, 2018, and 2021 polls, we found that residents throughout the Great Lakes region of both the U.S. and Canada, as well as First Nation communities, are more than 90% interested in protecting the lakes and doing whatever we can to protect the lakes. And so I think the community power and collective action is there. I think we just need to be translating those principles and ideals and value systems into our legislative system, and we're just not fully there yet.
Okay, Michelle, how do waste management policies affect lake conservation?
If you're going to talk about this, I can think of this just based off the kinds of work that I do in terms of nutrient management waste, but also things like plastic waste is a huge issue with the Great Lakes. We see 22 million pounds of plastic on average entering the Great Lakes each year. So when it comes to waste management policies, and if I speak to this question just from a nutrient management perspective, I think the most important thing we need to think about is reducing the inputs of nutrient pollution that are entering the lakes. There's a few, we can also tweak the system and change the practices that we're using. So there's something called best management practices for agriculture that reduce the amount of excess fertilizer and waste running off into the basin. But we actually need to reduce these inputs from a systemic level. And some of that involves things like from the very early stages and steps. You have things like crop advisors giving advice to farmers about applying fertilizers at the right rates. And it's worth noting that oftentimes these crop advisors are also working for private interests where there's an incentive to sell more fertilizer. So we have excess phosphorus inputs entering the Great Lakes. And then switching gears a little bit to plastic waste, in terms of provincial management of this issue and how it impacts the Great Lakes, we know, for example, things like deposit returns on non-alcoholic bottles are a proven way to help keep plastic waste out of our waterways, out of our landfills, and Ontario doesn't currently have that. We also know things like reuse systems can help out with our waste management problems. But at the end of the day, we need to also be addressing the fact that we have large amounts of new plastics that are entering the economy and society every year. And we need to also be looking at what are the incentives for the plastic industry to be a part of the solution if we need to reduce the amount of new plastics entering waterways and entering the Great Lakes, but their incentives are driven by producing more to make more money. There's a conflict of interest at play. So we have to think about what kinds of policies and legislation could help us to actually reduce the amount of new plastics that's entering society, in addition to some of these other fixes, such as things like deposit return programs.
And how much of an appetite do you see among decision makers to solve this problem?
I think there's definitely a lot of people across different levels of government and different agencies who do want to address this issue. I think that there is always going to be pushback from large industries such as plastics, same with agriculture, same way we see fossil fuels push back on climate goals. But I do think that there is an appetite to solve the issue. One of the things that that's difficult to address is when you're dealing with these issues across different levels of jurisdiction, or you have multiple agencies that are responsible for pulling different levers, like the Ministry of Agriculture and the Ministry of Environment. It's not always easy to get everyone rowing in the same direction to achieve the outcomes for the environment that would be most desirable, while also having parties that are looking to balance economic growth and other factors such as that.
Rowing in the same direction is a perfect metaphor when we're doing a program here about the Great Lakes, so well done on that. Let me, we obviously wanted you two here because we're in the midst of a provincial election campaign right now, and we're trying to gauge how much interest there is among the four major parties, and the others for that matter, on making some progress on the issues that you two care about so much. So let's get this on the record here. The Chiefs of Ontario released a call to action for the next provincial government last month titled Creating a New Legacy, Building a Strong Foundation for Future Generations. And it includes 5 priorities, one of which is sustainable community development and environmental protection. And here's an excerpt. Climate change is disproportionately affecting the health and well-being of First Nations peoples in Ontario and has increased food insecurity for many already vulnerable communities. The Government of Ontario must ensure that First Nations are afforded the resources and political access necessary to become active participants in decision-making processes related to climate change mitigation, adaptation, and monitoring. Okay, Kelsey, come on in here. How much are you seeing among the 4 major parties in particular to address the issues just enlisted in that paragraph?
Quite honestly, not much. And when we do see these issues adequately and thoroughly addressed with nuanced attention to detail, they are often being addressed by Indigenous candidates themselves running in the provincial elections. So what we really need is to see more candidates across all of the parties and party leadership more predominantly responding to calls from First Nations, from organizations like the Chiefs of Ontario, and really building upon these calls to action that have been sort of put forward for them on a silver platter. And yet we're not really seeing them being picked up properly or authentically. And so I think if we're going to tackle climate change, we really have to address those frontline communities, which are Indigenous nations, and we're not currently seeing that from the parties right now, and that's unfortunate.
Michelle, how about you? Are you seeing enough in the party platforms to make you feel somewhat optimistic about the way things might go?
I think that there's definitely some strong platforms out there that have the environment in mind, that have climate change in mind and freshwater protections in mind. I think that we can do better. I think it's up to everyone to do their own research and look at what are these parties saying they're going to do when it comes to the environment and things like freshwater protection, and how does that align with what environmental experts and groups such as the organization that I work for, Environmental Defence Canada, how does that align with what we're saying needs to be done in order to protect the natural world, in order to have strong conservation policies. I think it's really important for when folks are going out to vote for the next leadership and they're thinking of issues such as the environment in mind, which is only one important issue, but they're thinking about how are we prioritizing growing our province and developing our province, but not doing it at the cost of things that will cause immense harm to the environment in the near term and in the long term. We can't have governments that are putting forward development visions that are not taking into account what environmental experts are saying when it comes to things like growing our cities and improving mobility between our cities as well.
Yeah, Kelsey, I know all the major parties have got something to say about the environment writ large, but I must confess, off the top of my head, I can't recall, and that's not to say it hasn't happened, but I can't recall seeing anything specifically about the Great Lakes, and in particular about Indigenous communities that depend on the Great Lakes in the platforms. Am I missing something? Is there something there that you know of?
At this time, no, there's not something more that I know of. I do know that, as I mentioned earlier, that specific candidates have raised certain issues that maybe they feel fall under the larger environmental issue platform of certain parties, but it's on a case-by-case basis. And like I said before, for those issues that are of grave concern for First Nations and Indigenous communities, like our ongoing water crises, they've largely been raised by Indigenous candidates running within the provincial election. And that's not to say that others may not be doing it, but I definitely have not seen it at the level of Indigenous candidates. And to really make a concerted effort to change these systemic crises, we need everyone to be a part of the process for change and to really be strong in their allyship.
Okay, Michelle, I don't want to get you into trouble here. Honestly, I really don't want to get you into trouble because I think you're affiliated with a nonprofit, a charitable status organization, which tries really hard to avoid being partisan in a political way. So I'm not asking for your endorsement of any particular party running in this election. But having said that, if you did want to weigh in and say what these guys are saying about these issues we like, and what these guys aren't saying about these issues we're disappointed in, now's the time.
Well, it is a great question. I have had a chance to look over all of the different platforms by the different parties. And I think from what I've seen in terms of balancing things like climate change and freshwater protections, there are certain platforms that do stand out from what's being put on paper.
You want to name names?
From what I can see, I think that the Liberals, as well as the NDP and the Green Party, have all put forward some commitments to the environment that would achieve, desirable outcomes for the environment and put us on a right track. I haven't seen much come out of the Conservative platform. There is some things in there to do with electric vehicles, which are obviously an important part of the solution in terms of climate change. But beyond that, I don't know much what their plan is in terms of conserving nature, protecting the Great Lakes, protecting fresh water, addressing climate change in a way that will help us meet our targets. But what parties put on platforms and what they are able to roll out when they're in power and implement is something that remains to be seen after each election. So I would just, again, encourage people to go and do their own research and look at what are the party platforms saying, because at the end of the day, for someone like myself in an organization that I work for, it isn't about the party. It really is about what are they saying they're going to do for the environment and how will it benefit the environment. Well, and we would be partners with, we would as an NGO and a nonprofit, want to be partners with whatever kind of government comes into power in terms of helping us achieve the environmental objectives that we would like to see happen.
Sure. And Kelsey, I mean, in fairness, there has been a great deal of discussion about EV, electric vehicles. There's been a lot of discussion about electricity generation and what's the cleanest form of making that happen. Carbon policies, how to get more carbon out of the air. We have heard a lot about that. Water conservation, I'm not sure I've heard much, if anything, about that. Do we need to be talking about that more in this campaign?
Definitely. When we think about climate change, the hydrologic system is critical to being able to maintain planetary well-being. So if we are not actively working to conserve and create legislation and regulations that conserve and preserve our water resources and the Great Lakes, then we are largely in part actively working against or working to advance our climate crisis, rather than try to address it and to heal the climate emergency that we currently have ongoing. So protecting water is critical to achieving the targets that we've set out for climate change. Another way to think about this is that climate justice, which many climate activists and those seeking climate action are working towards, is not possible without water justice. And so ensuring that there is access to clean, safe drinking water for all, and ensuring that freshwater ecosystems themselves have the water necessary to be healthy and thrive is a key component to maintaining biodiversity and addressing our climate crisis.
And Kelsey, just in our last minute here, I know you're a member of the Great Lakes Water Quality Board, which is a nonpartisan organization. So again, I'm not asking you to do anything you don't want to do here. But, again, as I offered Michelle the chance, if you want to say which of the major parties you think has the best story to tell on this, now's the time.
I actually think I'm in a very fortuitous position that all of the parties have somewhere to grow and somewhere to build from, because right now, as you mentioned earlier, we're not seeing a level of engagement with issues and platforms around the Great Lakes, around water conservation, around engagement and support for Indigenous and First Nations throughout the province. And so being able to see more of that, being able to see more parties actually respond to the beautiful ideas that were put forward by the Chiefs of Ontario, I think would give me the opportunity in the future to maybe be able to respond to that question. So it's a bit of a race. Let's see which party actually decides to step up to the plate and do calls to action that respond to Indigenous nations and their needs in this election.
Gotcha. Kelsey Leonard, Michelle Woodhouse, good of both of you to join us on TVO tonight. We're very grateful.
Thank you.
Have a good evening. Thank you.
And that is the agenda for Thursday, May the 12th, 2022. Tomorrow, Liberal leader Stephen Del Duca will be here on the platform his party released this week and why he thinks the Red Team is ready to come back from 4 years in the political wilderness. We hope you'll join us for that. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.